Coming up this week on the Digital Lifestyle Show, we've got Microsoft's Pete Brown joining us, and he's going to be telling us about what's going on in the world of MIDI and audio at Microsoft. Mainly, we're talking about MIDI Network 2.0, where we can have MIDI devices connected over a network rather than DINs or USB plugs, and what that's going to mean. He'll be talking about the new inbox driver that's coming for ASIO, so you could be the end of the road for having to download special ASIO driver software for your audio interfaces. He'll be talking about Snapdragon and how that's being supported now for music applications as well, from people like Cubase and others as well. So loads to talk about with Pete, so let's get straight to Pete. Pete Brown, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be on again.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. And once again, it bridges our worlds of music tech, Windows, Microsoft, all these things, development. It all comes together on a show like this. So we do like doing these, and we do like getting you back on.
Yeah, and apparently British game shows and panel shows at the same time too, from the early discussion, right?
Yeah. And the reason why I wanted to get you back, I wanted to do an update on some of the MIDI stuff that's going on at Microsoft, but not just the MIDI. There's a lot of stuff around audio drivers for the Snapdragon stuff. There's some MIDI 2.0 stuff. So there's quite a few things happening. So I wanted to get you back on to talk about that. So MIDI 2.0 and the new stack in Windows. You talked about it we won't go into too many details because you talked about it on the show a couple of months ago. So what's the progress on that? How's that going with Windows?
So first of all, it's going really great. As is expected, we're a little bit further behind than I would hope. It's just the nature of the software development process. But we went into insider Canary builds specifically last month. And so the latest insider Canary builds have the bits in place, but they're more developer focused still. Because they don't have all the backwards compatibility stuff for WinMM in there just yet. In fact, Gary had just sent me a PR on GitHub today that has a lot of the WinMM stuff on it. So I'm going to try that out. And if that works, we'll try to roll that into the next set of Canary builds. But I think because Christmas is coming up, I don't know when our next window is. It might actually just be in early January when those go out there. And that will most likely, assuming testing goes fine, be more appropriate for individual musicians and customers to try out. Because what we didn't want to do was have people that are using, a regular DAW today, like go in, enable Windows MIDI services, and then only one device works on one channel or something, which is essentially where it is right now, because that would be absolutely terrible and would break everybody. So as soon as the backwards compatibility stuff is in place, we can turn it on by default. Right now, you need a special program. Like the bits are in there. If you looked in System 32, you'll see the Windows MIDI services bits, but they're not turned on because you need a special tool to turn them on to enable it and have it take over all the device enumeration and stuff like that. And so again, working with some developers on that. So the next big milestones for that are, finishing up this backwards compatibility work, which might be about 80 or 90% there based on what I'm seeing from the PR today, which I'm really excited about. I can't wait to see that fully working. And then at the NAMM show in January, I'm going to be showing some apps that are using it for one thing, but then also our Network MIDI 2.0 implementation, which that's a standard that I don't remember if I talked about it last time I was on here, but that was just approved as a standard last month and voted on by the MIDI Association. So it's now official and it's public. And this is, in my opinion, probably going to be way more important than like USB or any other transport for MIDI going forward. I mean, network is just so much more forgiving. You're not stuck with a 1 meter length cable. Like you can have 100 feet or 300 feet or whatever that distance is, and be able to do a lot more with that. And it has enough bandwidth to make it really simple for having a single cable that's multiplexing multiple different MIDI devices on there. So that's one I'm really excited about.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about. Go ahead, Gary.
I'm really excited about that with my setup. It's getting cabling is really tricky. So network stuff's gonna be. Is there any limits on the sort of nodes on that network MIDI side of it?
There's nothing. I mean, there are going to be practical limits based on bandwidth over time, but it's just using standard UDP. Going across the wire. So we're not doing anything that would limit that, and it uses MDNS, multicast DNS for advertising these different devices. So I'm sure there are some practical limits inside there for how many reasonable MDNS advertisements you can have on a single network before it just becomes all noise. But I don't think folks are going to generally run into that. And by the way, so thinking back to it, RTP MIDI also uses MDNS, but it requires Apple Bonjour. This version uses our native MDNS stack in Windows, so there's no more requirement for using Bonjour or something like that. And it's ultimately, I think this is going to end up replacing RTP MIDI for most folks. It's a less complex standard. It's super fast. It's got built-in error correction, and it's going to be really good. You mentioned the cabling, and I know that I don't want to say too much, but I know some companies that are producing breakout boxes. So you'll be able to have a box that has a network MIDI cable or network MIDI interface, but then it surfaces 1 or 5 USB connections on it. So you can have that on the other side of the room, stay within your USB cable limits, and then still be able to have all the right network MIDI stuff. So I think that'll be fantastic.
That sounds great.
So if you've got I've got a synth and I want to connect it up to Windows, how would you actually do it via the network then?
Yeah. So you can do Wi-Fi, although we all know the risks associated with Wi-Fi and distances and things like that. So you would just use a regular Ethernet cable, connect it to Windows like any other piece of networking equipment. And if the device knows network MIDI, and adheres to that protocol, it's going to start advertising itself as something that can be connected to. And Windows also advertises itself as something that can be connected to as a host. And the user will use the settings application for MIDI 2.0 that will enable them to say, these are connections I want to make, and these are connections that I want to have automatically reconnected whenever Windows restarts or something like that. So they'll have control over that, as well as supplying any required passwords and things like that through that settings application. And then everything else in it just works like any other MIDI connection, because the way I've plumbed it through is it goes through the service and it gets enumerated just like a USB connection or an app-to-app MIDI connection or any of the other ones. And applications don't need to know anything at all about the protocol. They just talk MIDI like they normally would.
So will we see devices ended up with Ethernet ports on them?
A lot of them already have them.
Yeah.
And even like really inexpensive microcontrollers often have the right circuitry in them for doing Ethernet stuff. They just need like the magnetics or whatever to be able to connect to these devices. It's probably even less taxing on these small microcontrollers than something like USB 3 or definitely Thunderbolt or something like that. So I would not be surprised at all to start seeing a lot of devices start coming out with this, because it just, I think about the stage as well. Like the people to have MIDI devices on stage today that are connected to each other. People jump through all sorts of hoops with breakout boxes and different types of connections and snakes that go backstage. If you can just deal with normal Ethernet cables and not have to worry about all this other stuff, it makes all that so much easier.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, it's going to make it a lot easier. I've got like 3 MIDI USB interfaces here to connect to these, and that synth over there is on USB, and those over there haven't got a cable long enough, and so it makes it a lot easier if you can start doing that.
Right. And it
and
uses
even just
normal...
the other side of the room.
Oh, right, yeah. And it uses normal Ethernet cabling, normal routers. We don't require anything special for that. It uses your existing infrastructure.
Yeah, I think it's going to make the setup like I've got now, where I want everything available to be able to talk to everything without having to physically repatch stuff. It makes that so much easier.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm really excited about that one. So what we'll show in January at the NAMM show is an in development preview. It'll have everything except for possibly the network security piece, like for devices that require a password, because that requires a little bit more work on our side to do that. But everything else, the communication between the devices and stuff, will all be working. And I know it'll be demoed at a couple of booths there up at the NAMM show.
Wow, that sounds great. And of course, then the PC Windows running MIDI 2.0 is where it can do all the clever routing as well.
Yeah, and so you'll be able to treat this just like you would any other MIDI connection. One of the things that is coming after version 1 is this kind of virtual patch bay idea inside Windows MIDI services, being able to route anything to anything else. It's not making it for the first release because we have to cut off at some point and actually let people start using the bits here, right? But it's in development and it will hit afterwards. And so this can participate in that. So you could route one network MIDI device to another, or you could route a network MIDI device to a USB device, or you can have a network MIDI device connect directly to an application, or you can multiplex between them or fan them out, whatever. I think it's going to be really, really powerful.
Yeah, I like the sound of that. Yeah, and it's because it's a standard, then I guess everyone, all the manufacturers can adhere to it and roll it out.
I mean, Apple's part of the MIDI Association. I assume that they're going to have an implementation available at some point as well. And if you're looking for, how do I use my iPad as a controller for a DAW running on Windows, this to me would be the logical way to go about that. Where today you can use RTP MIDI and stuff, but we don't have a native RTP MIDI implementation in Windows. We may at some point, but I really think network MIDI is going to make it kind of obsolete. So to be determined. But this will be a great way for having these other devices, and also PC to Mac and PC to Linux, and all communicating with each other across the network.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. And I suppose for some small, like you mentioned, the microcontrollers, sort of a micro-controlled mixer or whatever, something it's not going to deal with big DIN sockets or anything else, so you can use a Raspberry Pi type single board type thing and make an interesting device that just communicates over the network.
Yeah, I mean, I love DIN sockets. They've been with us forever. They're really great, but on the other side of them, it's always a serial connection to the microcontroller of in some way, and those hit limitations that limit what you can do with them over time. So I think network is just it makes us part. What's interesting is it makes us, we're less a specific, like, oh, you need a MIDI connection on this device, where we become more of a software problem as opposed to a hardware problem, where almost everything has network capabilities of some sort. I say almost everything. I understand there are plenty of things that don't have it, but I mean, a lot of things have network connections, so you don't have to worry about having a specific MIDI port on it. If they have an Ethernet jack on the back or they support Wi-Fi, then they could very easily support network MIDI on there as well.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I think that's really good, and it goes together really well with the MIDI stuff that is going into Windows as well.
Yeah, I'm a bit biased. I think we have the best implementation of the different ones out there, but it's really starting to prove itself out with being able to just plug in another transport in here. Like the network MIDI stuff is being developed in its own separate project, and it just plugs right into the rest of Windows MIDI services without having to change anything in our core implementation. It just becomes another transport.
And I suppose it supports all the 2.0 property exchange and all that.
Yeah, so it's all everything in Windows MIDI services is UMP based, even when talking with older devices, and we do a lot of translation and stuff in there. And Network MIDI 2.0 is really one of the drivers for why some things were changed in the specification from USB. So there was, I know we don't want to spend the whole time talking about MIDI, although I could, but there was something in the USB specification called a group terminal block, which described different functions inside the USB device. They deprecated that, deprecated with a lowercase d in this case, because it's still supported really. They deprecated that and went with something called a function block, which rather than being a USB descriptor is now something that's sent in a MIDI message, so that you can query the device and say, like, what are your functions and what are valid groups, and like it'll say group 1 is the synthesizer, group 2 is the sequencer, groups 3 and 4 are something else, right? There's a drum machine or whatever it is on those, so you know which groups to talk to and then which channels inside those groups. Network MIDI 2.0 doesn't have USB descriptors, obviously. So the only way they had to come out with something in protocol to transfer that information to make discovery possible. And so that's really one of the things that drove this. And it opens us up to being able to support all different types of transports in the future, because it's no longer this really very specific transport technology of USB descriptors. It's something that's done in the protocol itself. We have support for it once inside the service, and then anything else we plug into it will just automatically benefit from that.
That sounds really good. So to see this is going to be at the NAMM show, is where we're going to see some of the previews of this.
Yeah, so there's I know I'm running a panel at the MIDI Association booth. Sometimes I don't know until right before I go, like, what else I'm doing. There may be some other surprises there, which we'll see when we get closer to the NAMM show. And then I know that the Ominote folks, they actually wrote the USB driver for MIDI 2.0 for Windows. They also are creating some hardware, so they're going to have some devices that are connected to Windows MIDI services in their booths at the NAMM show as well. So it'll have a pretty good showing of different things there. And to your other topic, the PC that I'll be demonstrating everything on there is going to be an ARM64 PC. So it's my Snapdragon X Elite PC that I have back here. So just showing everything is working. It doesn't require Intel and AMD chips. It's still, it also works perfectly well on ARM64 devices.
Which neatly brings us to the next topic, actually, because I wanted to ask you about, I think it was a couple of months ago, there was, you posted about the whole slew of announcements about ARM-powered MIDI, and there's not just MIDI, but audio drivers and that kind of thing. So just, can you tell us a bit, what was it that you announced?
Yeah. So Snapdragon Summit was at the end of October over in Hawaii. I wish I was over there because Hawaii looked fantastic, but I just couldn't make that work out. And at that, we had a segment in the keynote which announced a number of features for Windows on ARM. There was MIDI 2.0 is one, of course, because that's something that's coming here very shortly and also has full ARM64 support. But also for the first time, we are creating our own inbox USB audio class 2 driver with an ASIO interface. So we had this problem where we're looking at how do we unblock ARM64 devices for music creation, and like what's the biggest thing there right now? And the biggest blocker for people is, well, there are no drivers. There are actually a couple now. Believe it or not, in October there weren't any. There are no hardware drivers for these USB audio devices to be able to have low latency audio. Our existing drivers in box are not low latency drivers, so everybody has to go to the manufacturer, download their ASIO driver, install it, and then they can get just a couple milliseconds of latency on Windows through the DAW. So we didn't have any support for that on ARM. We knew that there were a couple coming, but we didn't have anything for, say, devices that people bought 2 years ago that are no longer being developed by the manufacturer, no longer in market. The manufacturers almost never, with a couple of notable exceptions, almost never go back and create new versions of drivers for old products. They want you to buy new products and move forward. And so we had this problem where you can do everything on an Intel or AMD PC, but you can't do all this stuff on ARM64. So Qualcomm and Microsoft and Yamaha got together and we put together a plan for creating an inbox ASIO driver. And the reason we went with ASIO in this case is solely because it doesn't require any changes from anybody to be able to support this. All the DAWs already speak ASIO. They understand that interface. It's kind of the expectation for music creation to have an ASIO driver for something. So we have an inbox USB audio class 2 driver that supports low latency and all of the I/O for the devices, which is important. Then an ASIO component, which sits on top of that, which enables all the DAWs on ARM64 devices to be able to do what they do best and be able to pump out and record low latency audio on ARM64. Our real intent behind that is to unblock the ARM64 devices, right? But at the same time, there are huge benefits to having this for Intel and AMD PCs as well, because you just, instead of having to go somewhere and download a custom driver, which you'll still be able to do if you want to, you want to be able to just plug the device in and have it just work, right? And so we'll also be deploying this to x64 devices as well, so not just
right.
ARM64. That'll probably be, it'll be very similar timing to the ARM64 stuff, but it might lag behind by like half a release or something like that. We're still sorting that out because our priority is to get the ARM64 stuff out to unblock people and then get the x64 stuff out for everybody else.
So if I got my Behringer mixer over there where I had to get a driver from them to an ASIO driver to get it to work, and they use a third-party one, and so I mean, I knew what to do, but if you didn't, it is a bit daunting. So with this, once that's done, I would just be able to plug it into the PC, and it would use the inbox driver.
Yes, and I should also point out this is so the in the Behringer case, they tell you to go download ASIO for all, which is a really good product, but it doesn't necessarily have the same latency characteristics as a native ASIO driver. It tends to be higher latency. Our driver that's going in box is not a wrapper driver like ASIO for all is, but it is a native ASIO interface talking to our kernel driver and getting you the same class of experience that you would have with a native driver that you would download from the manufacturer.
Right. So you're going to get probably a better experience than in my case then.
Yeah. You should get lower latency. Like our target, if we look at it, is to be in the same ballpark as the manufacturer's existing drivers that they have you download today from their sites. The ASIO for all type stuff excluded. Like obviously in this Behringer case, we have nothing to benchmark that against really, but in all the other ones, we're trying to get in the same general ballpark. And the reason why I'm being cagey about the exact numbers on that is because if you write a custom driver for one piece of hardware, you can do things that maybe perform a little bit better than if you're writing a custom driver that is supposed to support all the different devices that are in that same audio class. So I know we'll get pretty close to their performance characteristics, but if you go and download the driver from manufacturers who still want to offer their own, it might be just a little bit better. So for example, some of the other announcements made at Snapdragon Summit is Focusrite is creating ARM64 drivers for all their latest stuff that will be available early in 2025. And so theirs might give you just an edge over our inbox stuff, but it becomes an optional choice. Like you as a musician don't have to go and download that just to use your device, whereas today you do. Yeah,
that's really good. It makes life so much simpler, and especially if you're on the Snapdragon, because like you said, Focusrite have got those, but the Behringer one definitely doesn't. So.
Right.
Like you said, it unblocks that experience on a Snapdragon device.
Yeah, and a lot of people have asked us for, can you enhance it to add feature X or feature Y? And device aggregation is always one of the big ones people ask us about. This one is, we're not saying that ASIO is the new audio stack in Windows. This is more about let's have a way that supports musicians at the same capacity it does today. And also works on ARM64. So we're not necessarily, although we are looking at things for the future, but we're not necessarily looking to change the ASIO standard or add in additional features to that today. What we're really trying to do is to make sure that everybody has like a really great music creation experience. And then we can look at what else we do beyond that. Because, we have other work streams going on looking at what we can do for audio all up in Windows. But those are long term. Though, when we're looking at stuff, it can be years away depending upon the features that we're looking to do. Whereas something like this ASIO stuff, we'll have previews mid next year for customers to be able to try out. and applications won't need to adopt a new API or change anything about the way they do. It'll just have a good inbox experience that'll light up right away. Oh, and I should mention that the driver that we're building, two other things. At least the USB audio, the USB audio component at the least will be open source so that other manufacturers can look at it and also see kind of the best practices we recommend for creating this. And importantly, it'll handle all those power management events that a lot of devices just don't handle today. So there are lots of like little tweaks that that people do for, turn off your USB suspend, turn off core parking, turn off all these things. And a lot of those, not all of them, but a lot of them are driven by drivers that don't respond properly to those events. So they get glitches when these power management events come in and they need to do something. Whereas this one will show how to properly respond to those events using our driver framework and how to build an audio driver that I'm hoping will not glitch at all when these power management type events come through.
Oh yeah, that's good, because that's actually one of the issues I have with my setup. If you leave Cubase running and then you go away and do something else and come back half an hour later, it's quite glitchy until you kind of refresh it.
Right.
Somehow, I think if you activate the project, it's fine. But it's like some power management has kicked in and not resumed correctly, and I keep thinking I need to kind of figure out. I mean, it's not really that bad. You can just deactivate, reactivate. Yep. But yeah, so if the inbox drivers are already coping with this, then that would be much better.
Yeah. And also at Snapdragon Summit, we announced that. We also had Steinberg, as it's Yamaha, right? But Steinberg's audio interfaces have a beta currently available for drivers for ARM64 on their devices. So if you have one of these, like IXO or I think the UR22 or some of those other ones, if you have any of those devices, Steinberg currently has a beta driver that you can use on ARM64 today, so you can get going with that. We also announced a bunch of apps. And also, as soon as we announced that we were going to have ASIO in box, a lot of app developers suddenly like, oh, okay, well, that solves a problem for us, and we'll start porting. And so we're starting to see a train of applications come through, which is really what I was hoping would happen. But Reaper is one of the apps that has a release for ARM64 now. So if you're a Reaper user, you can go there and download that. Obviously, the Steinberg stuff was one of the larger announcements that we made there. We've been working with them for a while. So both Cubase and Nuendo have ARM64 versions in preview that you can use there. I also, I wrote the keynote part that was in there. So I keep saying but it's not me. I forget her name that did the announcements. She also announced Reason will be coming in 2025, running under emulation, and then after that they're going to go native. So we're really excited. That Reason has like a huge community of people who are super passionate about that workflow and using that application. So I'm excited to see that come. And then since then we had, Martin. I'm trying to remember how Martinic, I think is the way they say the name, released plugins that are natively compiled for ARM64, which is fantastic. They just went through, did their ARM64 compile, and they do a lot of really neat plugins with emulations of older synthesizers. So great stuff there. And Bitwig Studio now has a release for ARM64 as well. So, Kless did some fantastic work over there. He took a slightly different approach from the Steinberg folks, which is nice. We have a lot of different options for how you can target ARM64, whether you need to be able to load plugins into the same process or you load them in a different process, all that stuff. They took a very thoughtful approach to it, which kind of maximizes their ability to tweak and performance tune Bitwig Studio while still supporting the existing x64 VSTs and stuff that are out there today. So I was very excited to see that happen as well.
Yeah.
Oh, and there's one other hardware company, Audient actually went and recompiled all their drivers for ARM64 and released that as well, which again is fantastic.
Yeah. I noticed when I was installing Cubase on my new Surface, and I saw the ARM version was already on there. This was a couple of months ago, so yeah, they've been good with that. And I suppose, does it mean though, like plugin manufacturers have to recompile as well if you wanted to say in Cubase?
So one of the things that we've done is we've made it really easy for applications on ARM so the developers. Let me back up a little bit. So we have an emulator on ARM64. It's called Prism, which enables you to run Intel/AMD 64-bit applications on ARM64 devices under emulation. And it's actually quite fast. And we recently released support for vector instructions, which a lot of plugins and other things use through the emulator. So folks compare it to like Rosetta on Apple, a little bit different. And also we have the support for vector instructions, which if I recall, Rosetta didn't. But it is conceptually the same idea. It enables you to run this on ARM64 devices. Now, application developers can decide if they want their applications to be 100% ARM64 with no interface to the emulator at all. And they can compile it that way. And for example, that's the way that Bitwig went, and enables them to use all the registers on the ARM64 processors and do some extra things there. Or they can decide to run 100% under emulation, which is just running your Intel binary on your Intel/AMD binary on that device and having it run under emulation. Or you can use something that's a bit in the middle. And what that is called ARM64 EC, and the EC is emulation compatible. And what that enables you to do is you compile your application as a native ARM64 application. The only difference is it doesn't have access to a couple of registers, and there are a few other caveats in there that you can see in our documentation. But it enables you to mix not just that native ARM code, but you can mix it with Intel/AMD x64 code in the same process, right? So the original intent was really about partial migration of applications. So if you have a dependency where they haven't released an ARM64 version of it yet, you could still use the Intel AMD version of that and load it in your application, and just that bit of code runs under emulation where the rest of your code runs natively. Now, early on in that development, folks realized, all of these applications that rely on plugins, this is a fantastic way to also support those plugins. So I've been counseling where it makes sense, if they don't already use a separate process for hosting VSTs, that companies use ARM64 EC for their DAWs. So something like Cubase and Nuendo, they are ARM64 EC applications, which means, again, they get all the stuff that ARM64 has to offer, and they are running native ARM64, minus a couple of registers that may or may not be useful to applications like that. But they can load your existing x64 plugins into that process. So you don't have to throw away all the investment you have in all of the plugins that you've already bought for Intel AMD Windows. You can load them in just natively. Now, so what happens is the plugins run under emulation, the host runs natively, and really, like, if you're writing C code or C++ code, you don't even know. Like, there's no difference. The difference ends up being down at the assembly level, where we do a little bit of thunking between those to make that work. But the performance on that is actually really good.
Oh, that's good. So you could have Cubase, and I could use whichever BST plugins, older ones that haven't been ported over.
Yep. So the only other sticking points there are, does the installer for the plugin let you install on ARM64? Because some do block. They say, hey, this isn't a supported platform, but we're trying to work with the different vendors to get that out of the way. And the second one is iLok, where iLok, it's all, it's just one of the realities of this business that people need stuff like iLok. We're working with them to get a version that runs on ARM64. So any of your plugins that require iLok licenses and stuff, that will be coming. I'll leave it to the folks there to Pace to talk about when that's coming and in what form.
And why is it important then to get music production on the ARM platform?
Well, if I can be frank, it's a lot of it is Mac compete, right? So Apple, when they went to ARM, their battery life went through the roof, and people are able to make music quietly without fans blasting at them, wherever they want to go, mobile, right? So I mean that's something that is kind of native to the ARM implementation. It's just frankly, it's better on battery and better on heat than Intel, AMD current generation stuff. Hopefully nobody like kills me for making that kind of a statement, but I don't think I'm sharing anything new. Like ARM is just that's the approach it's taken. We've had ARM support in Windows for a long time, but it wasn't until this past year that we really had processors that were beefy enough to be able to compete well in against not just Mac OS, but even against other x64 and PCs, right? And so we want to make sure that music creation is supported fully on those because we know musicians want to be able to make music without fans blasting at them. And more people. I use a big desktop most of the time. That's kind of my setup, and that's what I prefer. But a lot of people get inspired by working, out in nature or around other people, or in a coffee shop or at a school or in a cafeteria. Like some people just work really well in those types of situations, and that's where they feel the most creative. And you really couldn't do that well with Windows in the past because you had to carry a great big power brick and make sure you were sitting at the one spot on the wall that actually has an outlet, right? And so we want to make sure that that these new types of devices support that better than anything that we've had in the past. It's really we're trying to win back a lot of we've kind of let Apple own the space for a while regardless, but then when Apple Silicon came out, it was clearly like, wow, all right, these are really good devices for making music on the go, and just we need to be part of that game as well, and to give people a choice so that if you don't want to use Apple stuff, you have a reasonable choice that's not a compromised choice.
Yeah, and I think the new surfaces are especially the Pro form factor is brilliant because I mean I like the touchscreen just for even just using the mixer with the touchscreen on the Surface. So yeah, it's a great form factor for that.
Yeah, and obviously my main desktop is a regular Intel based one, but what I use now for my daily driver everywhere that I go anywhere else is the Snapdragon X laptop, and it's fantastic for that. Like it's light. I really like that when I close it and I let it sit overnight, the battery's not dead when I wake up the next day. It only loses like a tiny little bit of battery life over the course of the night, and the performance is really good. There's more coming in this space over time, but I mean, for our first real shot at a powerful ARM64 device, I think this one, it really kind of nails it. I think it's a good device for people who want to run Windows and want to be creative on it. And you'll see a lot of our marketing focuses on image creation and AI stuff and things that a lot of musicians might think, well, that doesn't really apply to me. But there are a lot of things in that space that are making differences to these devices that accrue also to music creation. Like, for example, the NPU support in the AI, a lot of folks think like, well, I don't need that. Actually, you'd be surprised at a number of DAWs which do use AI in different parts. They just don't scream, AI, here comes some AI, we're going to serve some AI, and then get a figure with 15 fingers and, that kind of stuff, right? It's like not that kind of AI. It's more like a DJ Pro, if I remember correctly, that's doing like stem separation with using AI behind the scenes. It just doesn't scream that. It's just a natural part of the process, and it's something that maybe wasn't easy to do before or was time consuming before, now gets accelerated by the NPU. It doesn't use CPU cycles the same way that something running on the CPU does, so it's also much easier on your battery life. And it gives you the features that you were looking for. And so we're going to see more and more of that in the music space going forward, because I've already been talking to all the DAW companies which are using AI about how they can accelerate that stuff on the NPU and be able to still give a fantastic experience to the end user.
Yeah, I can imagine effects especially would be something that would be ideal. Noise reduction, adaptive noise reduction and things like that, where it can yeah. I've had it with audio files that I've done on the podcast, and I want to get some noise reduction, and you can never, you can't get it quite right. You've got to do, but I've seen these AI ones where they can actively clean them up, and it's a pretty impressive.
Yep.
So if that's in the door using the MPU, that'd be great.
Yeah, the podcast that I'm on regularly that I co-host with Vin down in Australia, the Dawbench podcast, he's got some AI cleanup tools that he uses whenever he does post-production. They're all offline, so it does voice isolation, because I tend to have this microphone picks up everything. It picks up a bee fart down the street, right? And so he tends to use that to remove all the background noise and to isolate just the audio for just for the speakers. But it's an offline process. Imagine that, just like you're saying, Ian, imagine that's something that's happening in real time as you're recording, like as you're mixing, as you're doing that stuff, where it's able to operate fast enough that you don't have to have a separate cleanup process afterwards. It's just always there. That's the kind of stuff that I'm really excited about to see AI used for. Not for generating music and things like that, but more for all the kind of the drudgery tasks that we have that computers are frankly really good at offloading.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that sounds really interesting, and I think the concept of a little portable studio with with a Surface and a whatever small mixer or whatever, or just a MIDI keyboard. Everything can be done in the box. And so yeah, it's really impressive, and like it gives options. I like having a big PC under my desk to do some of the stuff. But then when I'm out and about, I have the Surface. So yeah, and being able to share the projects between devices, cross platform, different processors, that'd be really good.
Yeah, and for people who are looking to target the ARM64 stuff on Windows, our APIs are all the same. Like a lot of times for even moderately complex use cases, all you have to do is recompile with a new target and it still just works. And yes, if you have assembly code in there or some like hand tweak stuff or special vector instructions, there's a little bit more work to it. But otherwise, it just works. Like all the MIDI stuff that I compile, every time I compile it, it's compiled for ARM64 and x64 for the service piece of it. And then the SDK is compiled for what's called ARM64X. Which combines EC and regular ARM64 in the same binary file, which is a separate topic, but it just makes it much easier for applications to just point to a single DLL without thinking about which architecture it is, and x64 at the same time. And I've never, with one exception, I've not had to make any changes in there that are specific to ARM64 or x64. The one exception is I'm doing some really weird what we call it, detouring of some API calls to make it so that WinRT works without requiring a manifest. That's the only place where we've had to have like ARM64 specific if defs in there versus the other stuff. Everything else is just super easy. And the reason I bring that up is I get asked all the time, like, how much work is it to recompile for ARM64? Like, I don't have any experience with doing this on Mac OS or on Linux, so I'm not sure if it's a different experience there and that's why folks are asking, or if they're just expecting kind of some major pain recompiling this for Windows. But I found it's usually just you change your target and run at it.
Yeah, well, that's really impressive. I think it makes it so that you can choose the device that or the form factor that works best for you, and you don't have to think about what processor it's running. You can just get what you need.
Yeah. And I know there's somebody right now watching who's like screaming like, no, you have to know. And yes, I know that there are plenty of corner cases where, like, when you start getting really down into the weeds, yes, you're gonna want to know which architecture and what you're actually running on. But for most cases, it's actually quite simple.
Yeah. And so if developers want to get started looking at making their applications compatible, what's the best way for them to start?
For music app developers, I've put out a couple of blog posts, which I can give you the links to, which talk about how to pick, ARM64 EC versus ARM64, because that's one of the decisions you probably want to make early on, because it sets the tone for a lot of the other choices that you'll make later on in the process. So I put some blog posts out there for guidance, and I was specifically thinking of like VST developers and developers creating ASIO drivers and things like that. But obviously for any application developer it would apply as well. And then just in Visual Studio, if you use Visual Studio, great. If you don't use it in MS Build, you can also specify just the architecture that you're compiling to. And it's really very similar to what you would do on any other platform for specifying that architecture. And it's really just about building your applications like you would on Windows at any other time. Like we've really tried to make things as transparent as possible, but at the same time, make it so you don't have to really think about, am I compiling to ARM or am I compiling to, x64 or something instead?
Yeah, and for the MIDI, the new MIDI stack in
Yep.
Windows, that's already available on GitHub, isn't it, for developers?
Yes. And I'm working on the next developer preview for that, developer preview 8, which is what I'll be using to demonstrate the stuff at the NAMM show. And then probably around that same time is when we should have something usable inbox in the insider builds for the general public. I don't want to promise it, but it feels like it's going to be around that same time. And the biggest difference is there that the insider builds lag usually about a solid month behind the stuff that we're doing on GitHub, just because the time it takes to get through all our internal processes and then get deployed out in an insider build to customers. So there's usually about a month difference there, which is going to start mattering less and less as we get close to the final release here in the spring. And so that, so if you folks want the latest and greatest stuff, it's on GitHub, and I'm going to have better instructions here for how to deploy things on the insider builds that already have Windows MIDI services installed, like how you can go about replacing that.
Yeah, that'd be interesting, because I've got one of my machines here that I'm going to put whichever channel the build it goes onto, then I'll put it onto that channel. I can give it a try.
Yeah, so let me see what version I've got. So the Canary build 27754 right now has Windows MIDI services in it, but that version of Windows MIDI services, like I said, is about a month and a half old, but it is there, and it just needs to be turned on. If you join us on the Discord server that I have, it's all linked. If you go to aka.ms/whack-midi, that'll give you all the links that you need to for which places to go. If you join us on the Discord server, that's where all the discussions are happening, and that's also where you can find out how to get started. And I just want to let people know that we're not quite ready for consumers and musicians and stuff to try it out yet. It's more for the technically minded and developers. And part of the reason for that is if you install it now, you can't really back out of, you can't really uninstall it and get back to basic functionality in Windows as cleanly as you could some other stuff in the past. So right now we're really focusing on developers and more technical users.
Yeah. And I guess then the next thing to watch out for is all the NAMM announcements and the whatever demos go in there.
Yeah, and NAMM is always really fun. I think this year will be especially fun, and we'll have lots of good stuff to share.
Excellent. Well, it's been absolutely brilliant catching up with you again, Pete. Really do appreciate it. It's always fascinating, and I always get really good feedback from your interview, your chats. So I really do appreciate you joining us, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you're showing off at NAMM.
Thanks, and I'm excited again to have been on your show. Love it. And if anybody has any questions, they can always reach me on that Discord server. If you go to ak.ms/whack-midi, you will eventually find me.
Excellent. Well, it was a pleasure as always, Pete.
Thank you.
That's great stuff.
Brilliant stuff. So I was just wondering if Network MIDI would actually work out of LAN, if we could actually do VPN on it and actually set up something where you have keyboard at yours and
why not?
Or something.
Yeah, if the latency is not too bad. There is some kind of, I think some of the software providers have some kind of collaboration tools their own collaboration tool. But yeah, if you could run over it technically would, wouldn't it, over a VPN? The devices don't need to know where they are; they're just on a VPN. So yeah, so you could have the MIDI module, the synth in your studio. I could play it from here, and you can send the audio back to me, stream the audio back to me.
Yeah, you'll have to try that when it comes out.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. That was great chat, and yeah, always fun talking to Pete Brown.